Simran, can you speak to the nuanced experience of the intersection between faith and race ethnoculture as it relates to religious inclusion or exclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, for sure. And even before saying that, I want to say, I as much as I'm an advocate for let's put it all out on the table, right? Like, let's not just focus on a couple aspects of identity, which I think is important, but like, let's also talk about other aspects like ability or class or caste or religion or whatever it is. I mean, yes, and I also understand that it's scary because religion is uniquely volatile. People have real convictions that shape how they see the world, and they feel very strongly about them in a lot of cases. And that's not just people who identify with certain religions. It's also true for people who don't believe in religion or identify as atheist or agnostic. And so it's a really tricky conversation, especially, I mean, I'll say this as someone who's a scholar of religion and somebody who practices and somebody who's advocating for this. Like, I avoid conversations about religion too. In a lot of cases, because I'm not sure how people are going to react. And so I get it. And I think what you're raising here is a really important entry point into understanding what's going on here. Because you're absolutely right that as with any society, we operate on the basis of social norms. And we are getting better at understanding how a lot of those norms are informed by particular histories of whiteness, European colonization, and so on. One of the conversations we're not having is about the role of religion in shaping these social norms. And if we just take a simple step of looking at certain aspects of how we even think about religion, whether in the workplace or outside of it, it becomes obvious to us that Christian normativity is cultural normativity, at least here in the US and Canada. And so if you take a look at the holiday calendar, for example, which is presented as neutral and for decades and centuries has been accepted as an even playing field for all people, and then you say, hey, whose holidays are these? What is our calendar based around? What days do we get off? And what extra days do other people have to take off? Right? Is it holidays like Eid or Diwali for Muslims and Hindus? And you can take it even a step further and say, well, what is our weekend and week structure, right? What about Jummah for Muslims? That's on Fridays. Are they expected to miss work? Do they have to constantly make accommodations in order to be accounted for in the workplace? And so that's just one sliver of thinking about how Christian normativity defines the experience for people, but then also makes it increasingly difficult and exceptionally difficult for minoritized religious communities. There's one other thing I want to say here, and that is there's a way into this conversation that I think is very provocative and challenging in a lot of ways, but actually very helpful for those of us who think about DEI. And that's thinking about the work that we have done as a community to understand white normativity, and then translating that racial lens over to a religious lens and saying Christian normativity, right? So we now have frameworks and models in our heads for understanding how systemic bias becomes institutionalized and then filters down to the people on the basis of white supremacy. And we can say, actually, if we take a religious lens and think about this from the perspective of Christianity, we can see how there are certain communities who are being marginalized unintentionally in a lot of cases, but in ways that really impact their day-to-day lives and their experiences at work. And so I think if we're willing to make that move and ask the question about how something like religious normativity can impact us at work, then we can actually make a lot of progress in identifying the issues and then starting to seek solutions.